Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here with you all. I'm excited to be having this conversation about the new publicized Smart Building Overlay for the RIBA Plan of Work. And we've brought together two stakeholders in this process. One of the co-author organizations, Hoare Lea, represented by Ciaran Kelly, and one of the peer review organizations, Vanti, represented by their CEO, Mike Brooman. And we're really excited to just kind of dive into what it is, where it came from, what its intentions are, plans. Also, let's talk about some of the feedback that we're hearing, some of the aspects that are great and landing really well, and some of the things that are being discussed now in the market. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Ciaran and Mike onto stage just to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into it.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Let's start with you, Ciaran. So maybe just a quick introduction of you. Who's Hoare Lea? Who are you? And yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm Ciaran Kelly. I'm one of the building intelligence leads for Hoare Lea. Hoare Lea are quite a large MEP design consultancy and operating in the UK. We've got about 1,000 people in the UK spread across about 15 offices. And we, as I said, we're primarily MEP, but we also have a whole heap of specialists, everything from air quality to acoustics to even a behavioral psychologist, and then ourselves, the building intelligence or smart buildings team. So we deliver smart buildings. This is our bread and butter, and I was really excited when we were approached by RIBA about 2 years ago to input into this plan of works to try and, I guess, demystify and improve the industry engagement around smart and building technology.
Okay. Yeah. And I think we'll circle back to the history where it came from, I think, but nice to have you here. Amazing always to have your insight. You're clearly a very well-respected professional in the space. So excited to dive into it with you. Mike, nice to see you.
Good morning. Absolutely. Yeah. So Mike Brooman, CEO at Vanti. We are a master systems integrator. That means we take different people's hardware and software that's typically brought in through contract packages into buildings and sit as an umbrella over them, make them all work together for the benefit of all the different stakeholders in the building. Was really excited when we found out about the initiative. We've been mapping our kind of key processes to RIBA for quite some time, but it's not something that's well understood, as generally technology isn't something that's been super prolific in buildings other than in very siloed systems. And now we're starting to get towards property developers, building operators, tenants, all wanting different types of data presented in slightly different ways. This felt like a necessary initiative that we can all at least get on the same page. And I think one of the things that I love about the industry is we have lots and lots of acronyms, but also acronyms in one place can mean something completely different in another. So just getting any kind of cohesion between all of that feels like a very worthwhile endeavor.
Okay, let's start with the acronym RIBA. For those that don't know RIBA, right? I think it's very much a British, UK focused organization. But Mike, maybe you can first start off with what is RIBA?
Sure. So the RIBA is the Royal Institute of British Architects. I'd probably defer to Ciaran on this as someone who's directly engaged with them. But the plan of works is really how you bring a building out of the floor from a patch of mud on the ground to something that's a finished building, and then hand it over to operation. So super well defined. There are other overlays, as I came to understand, that are really designed to be helping architects in terms of bring those things into their own established process. I think from my perspective, and there's even an entire book written on this now called Building the Future, the pace of change and what happens within the built environment is generally quite slow. It's generally quite risk averse. And when that meets technology, which is generally spinning a lot quicker, it's like trying to bring two cogs together that are spinning at different speeds. So there is a real need for understanding of both parties, one that probably could do with going just a little bit quicker, being as digital adoption in the built environment is currently behind agriculture and hunting, which is a spectacular fail. But then also from a technology perspective, you're not going to get 1 million buildings suddenly to adopt a product overnight, because that isn't how the industry works.
Ciaran, how do you want to add to that? I mean, let's start with maybe the RIBA process. What is?
Yeah. So the RIBA process is split up into 8 stages, numbered 0 to 7 for some weird reason. You can tell it was an architect who put it together and not an engineer. But yeah, so that's step 0 is basically your building conception, all the way through your building planning, and you're narrowing your technical design throughout the process, and eventually we come all the way through to stage 5, which is construction. Stage 6 is your handover, and stage 7 is your operation. And the thing about the RIBA stages, and you'll notice in the RIBA logo, it's a cycle, it's a circle, and the whole idea is the learnings you make throughout that 0 to 7 process, when you get to stage 7, they feed back into stage 0 again, so that we can continuously improve. And that is also one of the reasons why we were super keen to partner with RIBA for this overlay for their plan of works, because they view things as an evolution. And we were never going to get this 100% right the first time, but because we've teamed up with RIBA, it is very much a cyclical process. So we will learn from this, we will improve, and there will be a new and improved overlay at some point in time, and that's what really made me quite enthusiastic about being involved in this, because it's not just a thought leadership piece from a load of people in the industry who think they know the right way to do it. This is what we think is right now, but we're opening it up to improvement, and by opening it up to the wider industry, we also learn from people who are not embedded in this on a daily basis, because it's very easy for all of us sort of building nerds to get together and talk about the wonderful things that we can do, but we're a tiny drop in the ocean of construction and buildings and real estate. And by opening it up to that broader audience, we broaden the feedback, and that, I feel, will help us to ultimately sort of narrow that field of vision and create a better product going forward.
Yeah, 100%. And it's really interesting to hear that from an architectural and construction perspective, that it is a cyclical, that it is a continuous improvement. And I think all of us who are in the smart building space from a technical perspective, see that continuous improvement as the entire reason that we're putting technology into buildings. So it does seem like it is a perfect kind of match to look at how does technology fit into that process, and hopefully improves that process over time as well. But let's take a step back. Where did it come from? Like how did the two? How was the authorship formed? How did the project come to be?
Yeah, so I mean, we've, as a building services firm within the UK and operating for quite a while in the industry, we've been very much entwined with RIBA throughout the life cycle of all the projects we do. Every project we do is done in RIBA stages. It's priced in RIBA stages. It's broken up in RIBA stages. So it's very much the Bible that we follow. And it was actually my predecessor who was approached by RIBA to sort of generate this document and start sort of moving into it. I only picked it up about 18 months ago, when I was the ball had already started rolling with it, and there was quite a lot of sort of content had already been created, but it was good to come in with a set of fresh eyes and work with my colleagues and with the other people in the consortium, Kier, Glider, and ScanTech, the three other co-author companies. And yeah, look, as I said, it's been 2 years in the making. This has been a kind of a little bit of a passion project aside from our normal day jobs, and also we've trying to involve lots of stakeholders. It can be quite difficult to coordinate all of those opinions and take everybody's feedback and make sure that we're, because to be honest, we could continuously take feedback and we would never get moving. And it would just continuously keep changing and we'd never get a document out. And so we also had to figure at that point where we had to say, okay, right, that's enough. We've got enough feedback. Look, the document looks great. And we're getting to the point where we're going to release it. And yeah, so I think it was almost 2 years to the day that we presented it at the Smart Building Show in London last year. And that was when we kind of launched the whole idea around sort of the journey, why we're doing it, and a little bit more detail around the document, but without going into too much heavy detail. And then, we finally got the document released on the 1st of February. And I've had mixed feedback, but I would say 95% positive feedback and 5% of a challenge. But look, that's why we do what we do. We need to be challenged, and that's why it's launched into the public domain, to be challenged. Because as engineers, we come up with engineering solutions, and sometimes we forget about the reason why we're doing it, which is for the people and planet. And I don't want to sound like sort of cliched or anything, but that is the reason we do these things. And that's
critic is the easiest role, right? I think
it is.
The fact that there's been a very kind of transparent process to presenting this and bringing it to the market, invoking feedback, having constant discussions. It was also peer reviewed, and that's what we're going to speak to Mike about in a moment, where there were a lot more organizations that looked on it. I think you all should be absolutely commended for your work. And if we're 98% there or 95% there and need to focus on some 5% adjustments, that's a big difference from being kind of nowhere. So I think you guys should all be very proud and congratulated on the piece of work, because I've read it and I think it's fantastic. But from you personally perspective, and I just kind of want to dive into your experience with it. When you joined it 18 months ago, when you read that document, were we right on, or were you like, oh wow, we gotta make some changes to this, because you brought a new fresh set of eyes?
Yeah.
And what's super interesting as well is, like, SMART, since we started the Smart Building certification, it's changing rapidly. There's a lot going on. So how was your experience with where it was to where you are now, and kind of what is your prediction for how it's going to change moving forward?
I mean, for me, I was very fresh to it, because I lived in New Zealand before moving back to Europe, and so I had no exposure to the RIBA stages. So I was coming into a company, and a location where RIBA stages were all new to me. I mean, we had similar stages of construction previously, but it was never as widely adopted, and it was never, the Bible that you need to follow for construction. So I think my view on it was very objective. And to be perfectly honest, it was in pretty good shape when I got there. The framework around it was pretty much there. The content was very good, with some small little tweaks, but it was in pretty good shape. And it's that refinement process. It's the same with any project we do. That first 90% of the project is the fastest bit. That last 10% is always the bit that takes almost the same amount of time as that previous 90%, because it's that refinement piece, and making sure that it's very easy to put a very loose framework around something, and very, I guess, loosely assign elements to each of the stages. But when you actually come down to say, well, what are we trying to say there? Yes, we say
getting the words completely
exactly
correct.
Yeah, and also making sure that we're not misleading people, and trying, one of the things that I tried to really do with it was to shift the focus away from technology, because it's very easy to get stuck in the weeds with technology and see technology, oh yes, this is the answer, you know, but it's actually not the answer because you don't know the question yet.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been trying to adjust it a little bit. Look, we still need technology, we can't escape that, but to try and really focus on the outcome piece first, and then backfill and fit the technology around that.
And I want to go into that in detail, because I think that's one of the criticisms or critical views on the process, is that technology is being decided too late in the process. And in a moment we're going to go through the different stages, but the technology is being decided too late in the process. But at the same time, it's like technology is moving so quickly that you need to wait as long as possible in order to it's a really tricky balance of when do you start to think about and bring in that technology aspect. And it's interesting that you say, you know, the last 10% takes the longest time. I think we can kind of create a parallel with buildings, right? Like the building, it often feels like it's done, and then it's like that last 10% is just painstakingly long. It takes forever, and that's kind of where we go. But I'd like to dive kind of into those stages, and then maybe you can kind of hit on that point of where the technology sits and why. So let's kind of start with stage 0. And which is kind of the strategic definition. And what do you guys try and do in that phase?
To be perfectly honest, very little. You know, this is not, that stage 0 is not. It's pretty much the aspiration. Do you want to put some sort of technology in the building? That should be the question you're asking at that phase. But you know, there's a whole heap of other things that you've got to focus on at that point in time. And I'm not saying technology should disappear from your radar, but at stage 0, you know, it's very much that, do we need to build a building kind of stage? And if we do, what type of building is it going to be? So it shouldn't be front and center of your thought process, but it should certainly be in the back of your mind, you know. And when you know, when you start to think about very rough budgets and sort of things like that, you should be applying it there. But in terms of technology procurement, that's quite a way in the future. But the thought is what we encourage at that point in time.
And then we move to preparation and briefing, and these are the RIBA stages, but we're just putting an overlay on top of them. So what are you guys doing in the preparation and briefing stage of
Yeah, so that's generally kind of when we would hope to get our first real engagement with the client team, because, you know, we're starting to look at sort of very loose spatial considerations. Then they will most likely have selected a site, selected a topology for their building, maybe a couple of different topologies that we're trying to test. And so we would engage at that point in time, look at, you know, the not only the building itself, but what's surrounding it, and look at, I guess, how we could very loosely give a technology brief at that point in time. And it would be a kind of a one-pager technology brief of, these are the considerations we think you should take into account at this stage.
Based on the type of building you're building, based on the kind of the first ideas of the value cases that you're
exactly. You know, if it's a science and research building, if it's a commercial office building, if it's a shopping mall, the use cases and the outcomes and the technology application will change ever so slightly between those different typologies.
Yeah. And the concept design phase, that's
when we start to get a bit more into it. You know, we start defining the infrastructure that's required. We start looking at the physical technologies that are required as well. So, you know, actual sensors and you know, the prime example is, if you want to use a mobile device as access control, you need to make sure that the card readers that you start looking at will be sufficient to use multiple technology credentials. And so, you know, we start looking at those pieces around then, and that kind of blends very nicely into stage 3. Stage 3 is when we really narrow that field of vision around technology selection. And when I say technology, I really mean hardware. We haven't moved over to the software side yet. We're really focusing on the hardware, so that, because generally off the back of stage 3 is when cost plans start being narrowed, and you know, and cost consultants start coming in to really give us a more structured idea around how much all of this is going to cost. And that's when the axe comes down and all of our stuff gets value engineered, because we didn't talk about it properly in the previous stages. But yeah, that's when our physical technology starts to be clearly defined, and then in stage 4 is when we start looking at that software piece and narrowing down. You know, instead of we will have a sensor here, we're now saying we will have this type of sensor here, and it will deliver the following metrics in the following format to the following platform.
Okay, so stage 2 is really functionality. Stage 3 is really hardware. Stage 4 starts to get into feasibility.
Exactly. Okay. And ideally stage, you know, somewhere around stage 3 or between stage 3 and stage 4 is when we would like to see the MSI come into the piece, and start inputting into what we do, so that what comes out of our, you know, what comes off our printers, well, not our printers because we don't print anymore, but what comes off our design in stage 4 fully aligns with, you know, what the MSI will be doing as well. You know, that I'm sure Mike will appreciate that early engagement piece for the MSI is just as important as it is for the designer to the successful delivery of a building.
And Mike, so I mean, you were part of the peer review model of this, so you are completely aware of kind of how this went. But what was your reaction to that? Is that the right moment? Is that for an MSI to join?
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone in the entire supply chain wants to be involved early in the process, right?
Yeah. Earlier.
Always earlier. I think and again, this is a first shot, right? So this is really starting to look at what are the key moments, and a lot of that is borne out through practical experience in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Because I don't know who is the author of the quote, but just around, you know, buildings being snowflakes, and, you know, every single one is different. You don't have the ability, because every building is really brand new. So, you know, we're always learning something. There's even, you know, a lot of retrospection done now on things like ventilation is taking inspiration from the 1920s, because back then buildings were phenomenally efficient because of how they were built with thermal mass and not glazed facades and all this kind of stuff. So it really is that iterative process that you were talking about early on. So in terms of where we're at today with the range of technologies and how they come together in buildings, this is a very good approach to how that works. And in terms of entering the peer review process, yeah, I mean, I definitely can't take any credit for the state of the document and how it's come out. It was in a really good state when the peer reviews were introduced. So it really was a look over and provide some commentary. Yeah. In terms of the engagement at that point, I think it makes a ton of sense in terms of where we are right now, and also going back to what I was saying earlier in terms of those spinning cogs coming together, right? People have been buying BMS systems, access control systems, lighting systems now for decades. They are very comfortable with the system topologies, the architectures, the vendors that they might use, how they're specified, what features they would be looking for. And so you can't go in with a, you know, revolutionary, let's tear everything up and do things really differently. because there's an entire industry that follows all of this in terms of main contractors and fit out contractors who are all focused around cost and risk. There isn't a, let's do something really innovative, because actually that isn't their model. Their model is, how do we reliably bring buildings out of the floor? Yeah. So it is really a, that stage 3, stage 4 moment is super key for all of the budgetary reasons that that Ciaran's talked about, but also to move to the other extreme, the very worst projects that we get involved in are brought in at the 11th hour. All of the systems have been specified and sometimes often selected with actual, vendors or contractors in contract. And you're almost kind of turning up. There's a series that runs in the UK called Scrap Heap Challenge, which is, 2 teams go and run around a junkyard and try and come up with a solution that they've been briefed on. And it does often feel like that. It's like, here's a bag of bits. Please make this smart.
Make it work.
Which, you might be able to achieve some results out of if you're lucky, but it certainly isn't staged and planned in the way that, the overlay seeks to kind of move people through the process.
Yeah, so stage 4, stage 5 it's a really, for an MSI, it's a really nice check and balance moment where it's like, okay, this is kind of the functionality you're after. These are the hardwares you're thinking about. You're working right now on your feasibility study of, can you pay for that or not? And that MSI then gets that moment to say, yeah, that's the right way to be going, or hey, maybe these are a few things you should think about, as in, it'll be more efficient if you do it this way, or maybe a different technology for that idea.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, because I think there is this view that we somehow are kind of parachuted into a project, and then all of a sudden we're going to, tell everyone how it needs to be.
Yeah.
And also, I've heard colleagues in a very large Big 4 company refer to the master as master and slaves, which, just to be clear, it is definitely not that. It is much more about master craftspeople in terms of, lots of experience across lots of different systems and the ability to coordinate between those different disciplines. And really, over time, our role will probably become defunct, because actually much more of the systems will be much more easily plugged together. There will be a lot more expectation that people are entering a technology ecosystem. There's always going to need to be the level of coordination, but I really hope it won't be at this level for too long, because it can be absolutely exhausting. But again, you have to look back over the sequence of events that got us to this point. And if you look at most of the technologies that have gone into buildings to date, really it's been, pumps, valves, actuators, hydraulics, pneumatics. It has not been network switches, servers, software, APIs, and now moving into, cloud and AI. That just hasn't even been considered in the industry because of its level of digital maturity. So there's a lot of very transient parts of this, which I think why it's also great that the authors, I'm sure that the peer reviewers will be exactly the same, that this is version 1. This isn't someone's fetched a tablet of stone, etched it in, and this is how technology needs to go into buildings forevermore. But it is at least prompting the conversation in terms of, how do we do this well? How do we make sure it's coordinated? How do we take the experience and make sure more people can benefit from that, so that what we're not doing is repeating the same mistakes and doing the same onerous tasks over and over again, particularly as we race towards, lofty commitments that have been made for 2030, 2040, 2050 as to what we're going to achieve in terms of efficiencies, and a lot of that being driven by technology. We just don't have the time to all be, arguing about the minutiae of, should it be stage 3.5 or, partway through stage 4? Like, we need to start getting on and doing some stuff.
Yeah, getting it done. Yeah, and I think we can do a whole nother session, Mike, on master system integration as a topic, because I think in the UK you guys are quite advanced in that space if we look at comparatively in other areas. So, but back to the overlay. Ciaran, when end of stage 4, where are we? What do we have then at that point? Master system integrator has been involved. We've already started to talk to some hardware companies and get some view on what's going on there. Mm-hmm. Where are we at the end of that before manufacturing and construction?
Yeah. So look, stage 4 is generally pretty much when all of the tender packages have gone out and we start to see some returns come back. So our involvement at that point is assessing that technology, ensuring that it fits the brief that we initially defined in the earlier stages. And then, as we move into stage 5, the construction piece, the manufacturing construction piece, that's when things get really, really important, because it's all well and good writing all of this stuff down and saying that we need to do all of this and getting all of this technology into the one place and putting it in a building. But, commissioning is incredibly important. And a word that we've kind of forget around buildings is testing. We think commissioning is just commissioning, like you put it all in the building and then you go and try and make it work. And I love Mike's scrappy challenge analogy. I think I'm going to use that, although I did get an image of Dick Strawberry pop into my head, which I don't know. You should look him up, Nicholas. He's got the most fantastic mustache you've ever seen. But yeah, so that testing piece around things to make sure it works. We're seeing a lot of, and I think, Mike, you have a very similar model in that you create this sandbox environment for device onboarding, because we're now, as Mike said, we used to procure these siloed systems and they would all operate independently, and it was very easy to make system A talk to system A and they all sit on the same on their own little networks. But now we're converging all of these pieces of technology onto one single network, and we're defining the data structure that each of these pieces of technology will deliver. So the testing piece, not only from a functional testing point of view, but also from a kind of an acceptance testing point of view, becomes incredibly more important. Before you get to that commissioning phase, this testing piece has to come into play. And I think we've been quite strong on that sort of test element, and test again before you get to that commissioning piece, because by the time you've got to commissioning, it's pretty much making it work. It's not, will it work? And there's so often, like my background is BMS, and so often I would get to site with a piece of technology with a high level interface that said it was going to be able to integrate with the BMS. Everything on paper looked great, and now it's been installed. It's up in the ceiling. It's behind the ceiling tiles. Everything is closed in. And we realized that, they've actually put the wrong network card in it, or the data structure is compliant but not conformant, and it's it's very late at that piece, and the finger gets pointed at the people who are integrating, not that sort of initial design piece, and so that's, I don't know. I'm really strong about testing and commissioning, and commissioning, and just really doing that, and because if it doesn't work properly from day one, it's never going to work properly. We're always going to be chasing our tail to try and make it work.
Well, and I think what you really love about the process is that it buys time at all of these stages, right? Mm-hmm. So often what you see is, like, when construction starts, that's when they start thinking about technology, mm-hmm. and then they start to actually make those decisions when construction is almost over, and by the time you put it in, there's no time for the testing.
Exactly. It feeds into the construction program. If at the very start of the build you don't have that test window programmed into the timeline, you're never going to get it, and inherently what's going to happen is that window will compress a little bit. As the technology providers, you're last in, last out. You've got to wait for everyone else to be finished before you can effectively start what you want to do. And so things like ensuring that adequate windows are put in place to do all of that, things like room ready checklists, so that we get all our active equipment into these rooms before we start connecting all devices. So so that's woven into the construction program, and that first kickoff meeting, that construction kickoff meeting is you slide that room ready list across the table, and you say, right, no technology comes on site until you have delivered us your complete serviced, cooled comms rooms, and secure comms rooms as well. Because we can't move sensitive active equipment onto a building site unless we know it's going to stay protected. And yeah, the program piece is incredibly important in the delivery as well.
Wonderful. So I mean, it really feels like that construction process has technology working side by side the entire time, and it's not just at the end of construction that we're racing to get it done. It's actually we're ready, which I think is if that's the only outcome of this process and this document, that's a great one. I would say.
Yeah.
So then you get to stage 6, which is handover. And talk us through that piece of the process.
Yeah, I mean, look, so the technology in a building is useless unless people use it. If it sits in the background, and it may do wonderful things, but if nobody can interact with it, if nobody can use it effectively, it's kind of, well, it's wasted. All of our effort to this point has sort of been set by the wayside because we haven't effectively implemented it. And so that the sort of the handover is more than just what we would call the defects liability period, which is picking up faults, picking up things that go wrong. We should really be looking at things that are going right, how we can improve on what we designed maybe 3 years ago. It can be that much of a time difference between when we design things, and that's a small time difference, to be honest. It can be, depending, if planning goes round in circles, it can be 5+ years. And so trying to ensure that the goals that we set out initially in those early stages are realized with the building occupants. The building occupants are brought on board with the journey. They're a part of the technology, and not just the technology just working in the background. And also taking in their feedback, doing things like post-occupancy evaluations to understand if we have hit the nail on the head with the users, because often in the construction of a building, the users will, they'll only, the actual people who use the building at the end of the day get very little airtime to input into the outcome. And so, so it's important to listen to their views, understand their views, and, tweak things if necessary, and use that period effectively. There's sometimes we call it a kind of building tuning period in that stage 6 but tuning again has never been effectively done. It's everybody meets up every 3 months and goes, is everything okay? Yeah, everything's good. Cool. Right, we're good. Tick the box, walk away. And it's really trying to get involved and use the data that these systems output to inform that process as well. We've got this rich data set that we can use.
And what we say, with the smart building certification is that we're not just talking about implementing technology and being done, right? We're talking about enterprise change. It's about, like, how are you going to actually use this in a meaningful way and align your process and your governance and your organization to the technology and the data that's coming out of the building. So I think to really take that time in that handover effectively. And of course, there's defect management and challenge management, making sure things are being optimized. But that proactive aspect of really adjusting the organization and the enterprise, that's such an important piece. And then we go to stage 7, which is use. So I think that handover period can probably last a very long time, because you want to make sure it's constantly being optimized and used. So there, it's reiteration constantly. But how do you guys see stage 7 and the use phase?
To be perfectly honest, stage 7 gets very little attention, and that is something that we're hoping will change. That oftentimes stage 7 becomes a separate engagement almost. It becomes something that wasn't part of the the initial sort of construction of the building. And I know certainly from Mike's point of view, you know, that the MSI becomes an incredibly important entity in the running of the building going forward. You know, because they were instrumental in bringing all of these services and all of these systems and all of this data to that single point of convergence. And you know, they can't just walk away at this point in time. They need to still be involved throughout the building, and you know, new use cases pop up where we might need to connect system A to system C, and you know, they become instrumental in that process, and the building itself becomes an evolution as well. We allow the building to evolve. You know, if a wall moves, if somebody moves their desk to somewhere else, if they suddenly put a photocopier in underneath the temperature sensor, you know, the building needs to evolve and shift and change. And we often run away once we kind of get our paycheck at the end of the DLP period, and forget about that use, and that sort of the building is a living, breathing element that needs to be sort of kept alive and kept in a healthy state. That's something where we're hoping to really get more involved in that piece and use the data that we've got, you know, and we've got sort of internal teams and sort of building performance and building operation that we're seeing get more involved because of the richness of the data sets that are now being delivered from buildings. They can very easily look at the use of a building without having to physically be there every week, or, you know, go and talk to people. They can generate, you know, decent reports. They can generate rich outputs that give them good insight into the way the building is running, and, you know, tweaking as we move as well.
And then how does the RIBA process then feed into the retrofit or the refurbishment process, right? Because if we're talking about cyclical, then retrofit and refurbishment is part of that cycle. So how do you see it running that program when you say, oh, it's time to make a change?
I think we're probably outside the realm of RIBA stages when we're in the sort of small change piece.
Okay.
But I guess, you know, something that can come out of, you know, especially, dare I use the phrase digital twin, but something around that's come out of a lot of our conversations around digital twin is change management, and sort of operating procedures around asset changes, and small alterations within the building, because we now understand that we've got all this technology, all this data, all of this information that was right the day we delivered the building, but that use period, you know, it needs to be updated, it needs to evolve, it needs to be kept current, because as soon as it falls out of alignment and out of, you know, it's not current anymore, it becomes useless and people stop using it, and then it gets parked, and, you know, it's not a valuable piece of technology anymore. And so, you know, that I think throughout the process, that change management piece is something that we're spending a bit more time on, and training the users of the building to understand and to know, you know, that if they change something in the building, it needs to be replicated on the systems, so that they don't fall out of date. So I think, you know, yes, it falls outside the realm of those RIBA stages, but throughout the process, if we've thought about it effectively, we should come up with the change management and the process changes that need to be implemented through that use period, so we can effectively document it, and it can be delivered properly as well.
Yeah. And Mike, how do you see that from an MSI perspective? When you stay connected to the building, you need to make adjustments, you need to, you know, update it, but possibly bring in new systems, these types of things. How do you see that fitting into the process?
Well, it's where the fun starts, right? So I think the analogy that we used to use was, people that buy building technology buy it like the toaster that they have in their kitchen, right? Like, you chuck bread in it when you want some toast, it keeps working until one day it doesn't work anymore, and then you throw it away and buy a new toaster. building technology doesn't work like that anymore, and particularly as we start getting into wanting to look at data and understand how things are performing. So it's much more akin to 747s designed for huge lifetimes, but designed very very modular way, so you can kind of pull bits out and put bits in as you're still using the asset. And yeah, that's really the approach. I think, to your point on when RIBA gets invoked, Memory have their beautiful graphic of life cycle of each of the different components within a building, from kind of facade down to device software. And really, RIBA would start being invoked at those major points in terms of the drop lines around major refurb and that kind of stuff. But otherwise, really what you're looking at is discrete adds, moves and changes, and those adds, moves and changes really need to provide great value at that stage, because everything is then into service charges and yields and all those other exciting metrics that people need to make sure are maximised when they have a building. I think the other challenge that we found is, whilst it's great that there's all this work being done at the kind of front end in terms of design and getting technology kind of segued through the process, we're now turning up to some operational teams that are kind of rabbits in headlights, going, we've never run a building like this, and how does it work? And I think also a bit of a disconnect as well at times between those people who have had ownership of the design of the building, what they think is important, versus an ops team who have day-to-day responsibility for often quite considered mundane or boring exercises like compliance and making sure that we're insurable and that the fire alarm works and those kind of bits and pieces. So there is still a bit of a disconnect there between the reality and the practicality versus, I mean, some of the best stage 2 reports I've ever seen have had sentient robots walking around the building for security purposes. And there's that kind of, how do we ground things in reality so that the early stages feed those people and make their life easier and a great success. But also, I think, focusing on what's important. The projects that we've been through, the most successful ones are always focused on a smaller number of metrics, a smaller number of outcomes that are going to either deliver real value or make people's lives easier, and whether those people's lives are the actual tenants or visitors to the building, or the operators or the asset managers. Where I think things can go awry is this kind of dragnet approach to data, where we're just trying to hoover up everything that's possible in the hope that we're going to pop some insights out of the other end. And really what that can arrive to is an operations team that is trying to get their job done in terms of keeping things efficient, keeping people safe. Not necessarily that they're hampered, but they're almost swamped with information that they can't turn into actionable.
And it clouds the whole space. It clouds the mind. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I think, our job as technologists all the way through this, and the analogy I often use in meetings is, you wouldn't turn up to a meeting with an international tax expert and apologize for not knowing about international tax. Like, you would expect for them to sit there and explain things to you in a really accessible way based on their knowledge. Yeah. But I think all the way through the process, and even when it comes into operation, we have this really different thing with technology, which is people are somewhat afraid of admitting that they don't know about it, and that often they can articulate what they want, but they almost hold themselves back because they don't feel like they're doing that at a sufficiently technical level. Whereas really throughout the process, and particularly in use, our job as technologists is to explain things in plain English, is to understand the requirements, whether it's all of the different lenses that are looking at the building, and even the subcontract supply chain, right, who are being thrust into this network enabled world that quite a lot of them don't understand because it's not where they've come from. So there's a lot of work to do on the accessibility, and that's where I think this document is a great first step into that, because actually it makes the available number of people who are actually being brought into the conversation that much larger. And if the architectural community turn around and go, guys, you've got this completely wrong. You know, we need to about face all of this and think about technology in a different way, which,
Fine.
based on the review process, I don't think we're quite there yet. But, you know, there are opportunities to tweak this. And I think, you know, Ciaran's point around program, the way that we've talked about stage 5 today is lovely. The reality on the ground is often bedlam.
Yeah. No, but I think that process gives everybody a clear view of where they sit in it and where we are in it, and then you know what you can expect. I know that we could talk about this for hours, but Mike, can you just say a little bit about the peer review process, how that went, and your experience with it? And then
sure. So, I mean, I think I've alluded to it already. The document was in fantastic shape when we were introduced to it. In my opinion, it certainly was evolutionary commentary, not revolutionary. And yeah, I think the mix of people that were in there bought a lot of really good lenses. But I think, you know, as with everything, and as a lot we've talked about today, you know, those lenses are many. You know, to get everyone who might have had an opinion onto the review panel to then, you know, to Ciaran's earlier point, actually get anything out into the world, just, you know, it's not feasible. So I think, you know, I feel very fortunate, very grateful to have been involved in the process. But yeah, I think even as we were going through the commentary around, you know, feeding back and forth on the document itself, or sat in meetings, there were still things that, you know, well, and as we've had with this conversation, you could have gone deep for hours on in terms of agonizing over and, you know, getting the absolute minutiae agreed. I think the other final thing I would say on this is, from a technology perspective, I think there are kind of different philosophies emerging. So, you know, the kind of cloud first approach is we're going to put everything outside the building and plug back into it. And then there's the building or asset first approach, which is, you know, the technology needs to be in the building and it needs to work, whether there's an internet connection there or not, whether there's a cloud service there or not. And I think that can drive different decisions throughout the whole process, and particularly in use. And a lot of that comes down to the commercial models that sit around the asset. And again, to Ciaran's point, if you're an owner-occupier, you have very, very different motivations early on in terms of what you're getting out the other end, compared to someone who wants to build a building, put an anchor tenant in it, and flip it to a pension fund. Yeah. Like, they are very different motivations in terms of how you need to make a set of choices throughout the whole process.
Yeah, 100%. Really, really incredible insight, guys. I know that we're at the end now. Like I said, I'd love to sit here and talk for hours about it with you, but I think it would be worthwhile in a few months' time to circle back and to have this process live, right? To continue to track its progress, track the feedback, you know, work together to source more feedback from the industry. But I want to thank you guys so much for your time and your insight, and for everybody who's watching. Ciaran and Mike are incredible thought leaders in this space, and a resource to get in touch with. So definitely get in touch with them directly. They would be more than open to have these really interesting conversations with you. We're going to put in the comments the link to download the RIBA document. I definitely encourage you to do so. And within there, on the first page, you'll see all the authors, all the peer reviews. You can also contact any of them. But this is a community. We need to continue to feedback with each other and work together to make this all work. Because if you look at that process, it is not one company doing one thing. You know, it's everybody working together to make these things a reality. And Mike, I really appreciate your grounding us in let's focus on reality and give people guidance in how to you know, make value or get the most out of these investments that they make, and not get clouded by all the clouds.
It's easy to get distracted by shiny technology.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we all have been raised now with like iPhones, right? Where we know it's there, we can dive into it, and it's intuitive, and we can do whatever we want. We don't need to do anything if we don't want to. Yeah, there's a lot of noise there and challenge in kind of navigating your way. And I love it because it's, let's think about what we want to do with the asset, and then do that, right? So thank you guys very much. Wishing you a
No
nice
problem. Thanks for having us.
All right. Speak to you guys soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.